Hello, Mark Kleiman.
I'm usually at the University of California, Los Angeles, but right now I'm visiting at the National Institute of Justice.
They're enjoying some of our East Coast weather. I teach at the University of Chicago.
But I gather recently you've been doing reality TV on Dancing with the Czars.
That's right. I just moderated a conversation with, if I can say it, Russia's drug czar, Viktor Ivanov, and also the American drug czar, who is a guy named Gil Kurlikowski.
Right. And the Russian is known as Ivanov the Terrible.
You know, it was an interesting conversation. By the way, I should say it was a terrific event in terms of the venue, and Mr. Ivanov is personally a terrific guy, and he had compassionate things to say about drug users, but at the same time,
not to do about them.
Yeah, I mean, what the actual policy positions that he held, it was really striking how deep a hole Russia is digging itself in many aspects of drug policy. Certainly the topics that I research, I got the feeling that he sounded like a liberal's caricature of William Bennett from 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So, for example?
Well, so I mean, the obvious elephant in the room would be the HIV epidemic, and as Blogging Heads listeners may or may not know, the Russian Federation has a population that's about half the size of the United States, has more people living with HIV, and also more new cases every year. It's an epidemic that's heavily concentrated among young people who are injection drug users. The Russian Federation had very few cases until the 1990s, and they basically blew that head start. And they're currently the policies that they're currently pursuing are basically the photographic negative of what they have to do in targeting HIV prevention to the people that really need it. But it's really kind of a tragic situation that they're falling further behind on. And so I'll give you one example. Would be that Russia really does not permit methadone and other similar therapies for heroin users, and throughout Western Europe and the United States, that's really the method that has found the most success.
Though methadone was early here, though, were reputedly the heavy drug war place. Other places like Sweden and France, Norway, didn't have it until the AIDS epidemic hit.
Yeah, AIDS really.
Then they gave in to reality.
Yeah, and there's also other medications which the Russian Federation does not use, of which Suboxone is another one that that provides substitution. But Mr. Ivanov was saying, was talking about how these therapies are substituting one addiction for another, and that sort of language, which is really something that that I personally find just fundamentally misguided, because in case number one, you have people who are engaged in antisocial behavior, who are running the risk of HIV infection, who are using a drug that has a very high rate of all sorts of problems. If you could get them to switch from that to a methadone maintenance regime where they're much more functional, where they're much less likely to get HIV, to me that's just a huge benefit, and we give and just to dismiss it with the with this kind of moralistic language is really something out of in the U.S. context would be out of the 1970s.
Right, so this guy's running a huge empire of mostly highly coercive drug treatment programs. Right, narcology is a big business in Russia, and he's rejecting the one drug treatment with solid scientific evidence in its favor.
Yeah, I mean it's just a tragic situation. Russia has a tremendous injection drug using population, and when I was there, I went to some drug treatment facilities, and the people, the professionals there are quite competent, quite well trained, but they just don't have in place the system or the resources or the kind of the permission in a centralized system to really do what needs to be done. And so I remember climbing a long dark stone staircase and sort of opening up this curtain and getting this whiff of sort of institutional smell that you get, say, if you went to a nursing home. And I looked down and there were these guys just just detoxing, lying on cots, in a big auditorium-sized room, and it was quite. This was not a place that was at all, the most forbidding in a Russian context, but that's just what it was, and they have such a long way to go, and they have an HIV epidemic which is just so concentrated in among young people who are going to be spreading it faster than the prevention efforts are going to be geared up to deal with that. I should also mention, by the way, that he was also against needle exchange, and he said we'd have to give out $1 billion. So Mr. Ivanov was against needle exchange. He was saying we'd have to give out 1 billion syringes, which would just be killing people. Yeah, I don't know the "and" part, but he found that unacceptable.
Right, and in the meantime, Russian heroin consumption is helping to keep the opium and heroin market going in Afghanistan. And Ivanov and his colleagues are demanding that the U.S. and NATO do something about it by spraying poppy crops.
Yeah,
it really is a caricature of the U.S. and Mexico in 1985.
It was really striking listening to the different perspectives in the room. It is Ivanov, and the Russian position is really that NATO and the United States should be doing aggressive aerial crop eradication.
Right.
And
anything that doesn't work.
We can talk about that in a minute. Kolakowski's view was Afghanistan is a sovereign country, and that's not what they want us to be doing. And there's some governors that are more interested in eradication than others, but you have to we have to follow the view of the sovereign government of Afghanistan in dealing with this issue, and that was something that was very different from the Russian perspective.
But also sort of a weak answer compared to, we know that eradication doesn't work. We know the result of eradication is growing more poppy at a slightly higher price. We know that the only way to have less Afghan heroin go to Russia is for Russians to use less heroin. I mean, to bury it in sort of international law stuff is really inadequate. I mean, you're asking us for something, you're asking the Afghans for something that's really wrong, really ineffective, would be disastrous for Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan has in fact done a very good job of controlling its poppy crop. Poppies are now grown almost entirely in non-government controlled areas, or as the U.S. and the Afghans like to say, 27 of the 34 provinces of Afghanistan are now poppy-free. Now, if we can translate that in English, the remaining 7 provinces are the Pashto-speaking provinces in the south that are dominated by the Taliban. So our drug policy triumph has been to make our enemies a monopolist in opium for the entire old world. Good for us.
Awesome.
And the Russian demand is that we do more of it. I'm just cynical and anti-Russian enough to think that they're hoping to get revenge for what we did to them in Afghanistan.
I mean, I must say, it's really striking. This is your expertise more than mine, but when I talk to people who are on the involved in DEA and drug interdiction efforts, I don't know of a single case. I think outside of Australia, there was a good example in Australia where in a sustained way, supply side interdiction of drug imports has really fundamentally changed what's happening on the street. And the idea that Russia could fundamentally improve their heroin problem by cutting off the flow from Afghanistan, I just don't know if I can think of a single historical example in any country where that kind of an effort has worked. And maybe you know of some.
No, I think Australia is your best case there. If you're an island with a very strong state, you can do that. But I mean, there I guess the key thing was Southeast Asia, which had been the supplier for Australia, and mostly dried up, replaced by Afghanistan, which is less convenient. But every place is convenient to Russia.
By the way, we'll take a short commercial break right now, if you don't mind. I'm going to just hold up. This is a new book. It's called Drugs and Drug Policy, What Everyone Needs to Know, by Mark Kleiman, John Calkins, and Angela Hawken. And it's an Oxford University Press book. And so this concludes the product placement part of
Right.
this Blogging Heads. But
Right.
it's an excellent book for those of you that are interested in drug policy.
Thanks for that commercial. When Oxford came to us about that, they said, we just write down stuff that scholars know about drug policy that isn't generally known. So it wasn't supposed to break any new ground. It wasn't supposed to have an ideological point. And by the time we got to the end, what we'd really written was a book about drug war ideology and why it's wrong. The subtitle is What Everyone Needs to Know, which is Oxford's subtitle for this whole series. But we really wound up writing was drugs and drug policy, all the false stuff we wish you'd stop believing. And I've concluded there's really nothing wrong with drug policy in the U.S. or worldwide, except that it's based entirely on false claims.
So what's an example of a false claim that the educated but non-expert is likely to buy into that just turns out to be wrong?
That most people who use addictive drugs get addicted to them. That most people who have a drug problem have a permanent problem because they have a chronic relapsing brain disorder which won't get better without treatment. That drug enforcement can reduce drug consumption. That drug prevention can substantially reduce drug consumption. That drug treatment, other than methadone, can substantially reduce drug consumption. That enforcement, prevention, and treatment together somehow constitute a drug policy. And all those things just turned out not to stand up to analysis. Oh, and that putting drug dealers in prison is a useful activity.
So what should we do with all these drug dealers?
We should put in prison the ones who are using violence or otherwise causing social problems other than distributing the drugs. So we should try to force the business into the least socially noxious form it knows how to adopt. In New York City, where there's really massive street-level enforcement, most drug dealing is now home delivery. People know what bars to go to find a drug dealer's business card. They call the phone number. They say some codes, and a pizza delivery truck comes to their apartment. And that's bad because it gets drugs to people who probably have a problem with them. But it's not bad for the neighborhood. That pizza delivery truck is no more a robbery target than any other pizza delivery truck. And so it's a little bit like prostitution, where the police of some places have figured out, no, we're not going to end this business. We're going to keep it off the streets to protect the neighborhood, and that's what we're going to do. And that's what David Kennedy's drug market interventions are about. So break up the street markets by putting pressure on them. Go after the violent dealers. And do enough enforcement so that the prohibition doesn't become a dead letter. You don't want selling drugs to be like selling bootleg video games. But you want it to be a little bit more effectively illegal than that. Most of the work of reducing drug consumption is done by the fact that there's a law that keeps them from being billboards advertising cocaine.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's several elements. You mentioned David Kennedy, and I think his work in High Point, North Carolina, is one example where they've gotten a lot of attention also in Boston. And there's different ways to do it, but the idea that you do violence-oriented policing, that you do it in a way that achieves real buy-in and legitimacy in local communities, and that you focus on disorder without incarcerating such a large number of people that you really are going to alienate a lot of the people that you most need to be on your side when you're doing law enforcement and community development and trying to help the communities that are the places where the open air drug markets tend to congregate.
Exactly right. I mean, the fallacy is that putting a drug dealer in prison keeps him from dealing drugs, the way putting a burglar in prison keeps him from committing burglaries. And the difference is that there's somebody else to deal the drugs. All you do when you put a dealer in prison is create a market niche for a new dealer. And so the 500,000 people we have behind bars for drug offenses, if that number were 250,000 or even 100,000, the prices and availability of illicit drugs would not be substantially different.
Yeah,
so,
in fact, the prices are substantially lower than they were for most drugs 25, 30 years ago. So.
Oh yes.
So we've certainly failed. If our goal is to disrupt these markets, we have failed. Now I should say, go ahead.
As the co-author of the paper about how increasing drug enforcement would lead to increasing drug prices, I deeply resent the rudeness of the real world in not going along with my theory. But
yeah, that ticks me off when that happens. Being refuted by facts. By the way, you've just described a bunch of sort of politically conservative fallacies. I think there are some ways that that liberals in thinking about drug policy also can err. And I think one of them is the idea that it would be easy to really reduce the number of drug-involved criminal offenders behind bars. Peter Reuter and I and Eric Sabigny have been looking a lot at jail and prison populations where we just look at offenders who have some sort of drug disorder, and it would be hard to substantially reduce the prison and jail population if we said we're going to, with almost anything that we've got in the can right now. For a lot of the people that are behind bars, a lot of, there's a myth that we have this huge number of sort of nonviolent marijuana users who are there for these kinds of offenses, and when you actually look at what's going on in there, this certainly happens. A lot of people are arrested actually, but if you look at the prison population, it's much more weighted towards people who've really committed fairly serious offenses.
Right. I mean, and the mythology that goes with that is that there's this magic wand called treatment, and if we wave treatment at the problem, it goes poof. That all the people with drug abuse problems desperately want to be treated, and the problem is that we don't have enough treatment available. And the brute fact is that when you impose treatment on somebody in a drug diversion program or a drug court, the dropout rate is extraordinarily high. The treatment's not very effective, and it's not very pleasant. And by and large, the people would rather have drugs.
Well, it is true that there's not enough treatment available, and there should be more. But it's not clear that providing the treatment that we're providing, it is true that many people don't do particularly well in treatment, and B, it's also true that a lot of the treatment that's out there isn't very good, and so we have to think about how to actually provide the treatment in a way that is more effective. And certainly, from a crime control perspective, you've got to think about what do you have to build into the treatment so that it's really going to be effective with the people who are out there committing crimes.
Well, so two things about that. One is there are some specialized kinds of treatment that are scarce. And if you want a residential program for a woman with children, that's still hard to find. But routine outpatient counseling for somebody with a crack problem, there are vacancies in those programs.
Yeah, but
what there is the right kind of intervention by the primary care physicians. Right, screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment is the slogan, and there's less of that than there ought to be.
And I think if maybe we'll get into this later in the conversation, but I think an awful lot of the outpatient treatment that's there now, is low tech. It really doesn't match. What would be considered best practice, and one reason why people do poorly or leave is because it's not being provided in a way that's likely to make it successful. And so there's a lot of treatment out there that needs to be replaced by treatment that's much more effective.
Right, but my sense is, to tell me if this is wrong, that if you had a really, really high quality treatment program for, say, methamphetamine, you might get 25% of the population better at 1 year. If you put those same people on drug testing and sanctions on probation, so they know they're going to jail for 2 days every time they're dirty, 80% of them will stop. That's the hope result from Hawaii. And you get the same result when you get people like physicians who have professional licenses to lose if they don't get themselves under control.
Yeah, tell us, just take a moment to tell us about what hope is and why you're sort of the hope guru. So tell us what that is. Or one of the
I want to say hope is my idea. I stole it fair and square from Eric Wish and Bob DuPont and the late John Kaplan. But I have been flying it like nobody would have it, with very little effect until a judge in Hawaii named Stephen Alm did it on his own, without reading any of my papers, which, again, is something I very much resent.
That may have made him more enthusiastic about the idea, I don't know.
No doubt. Anyway, so he invented this program completely on his own and called me 6 months after it started, said, somebody sent me one of your papers, maybe we should talk about this. Basically, he looked at the current practices of probation, which are that people get tested on a scheduled basis once a month, which means they just have to not use for 3 days to pass the test. And even so, 20% show up dirty and 10% don't show on any given testing date. And because of the large number of violations, the probation officers can't punish every violation. They can't write it up for the judge. And because the probation officers mostly can't do anything about it, the rate of violation stays high. It's the typical high violation, low punishment equilibrium trap. Now, it's not low punishment for long. Somebody keeps using, eventually the probation officer is going to take it to the judge and say, look, this guy's missed 3 tests and shown up dirty 6 times out of those last 12 tests. He's not getting on probation. Send him to prison. And that was what was happening to him. He was getting these motions to revoke probation from the probation officers, and he said, what's this about? Okay, so the guy's been dirty 9 times. I understand why you're tired of him. What I don't understand is why I'm hearing about this now. This is his 9th violation. What did you do the first 8 times? And they say, we warned him, we talked with him, we worked with him. But now I'm convinced this guy was not getting it, so I want you to do something about it. And the judge said, you wouldn't raise your kid that way. I want to hear about the first violation. And then they took him through the arithmetic that showed that that was impossible. Simply not enough of their time or his time to write up every violation. So he said, all right, let's concentrate on a small group of repeat violators that next time you would want to send away. And they did that, and he warned them, those people specifically, okay, from now on, every time you use, you're going to jail. And if you don't show up, yes, I have a cop to chase you right away. And because they believed that warning, most of them didn't use, or used once and then didn't use again. And since they were mostly compliant, it wasn't very expensive to punish them every time they were non-compliant. And the result is that in a year, 80% of them are free on the street and clean.
Well, there's a couple things about that, by the way, that I think are just worth noting. One is it's one of the very few things we do in criminal justice where you actually did a randomized trial, and where there's randomized trials happening now in other places. And one of the things that's really frustrating to me, we talked about methadone. I could make a bunch of factual statements about methadone that come from a randomized trial, but if somebody says we should really be putting more cops on the street, or we should be sending, AWACS aircraft out to the Mexican-U.S. border and do more interdiction and spend $1 billion, if I say, what do we have for evidence about that, people sort of stare at you blankly. And Hope is a great example of something where we could actually do evidence-based policy by trying a bunch of plausible things out. Hope happens to have good results right now. There's some other promising things that turn out not to work for various reasons, and that's part of the game.
Right.
So I thought that's one of the things that I find most admirable about this. And of course, it has allowed academic hawking it like crazy, which sort of the policy entrepreneur aspect is really important to get ideas like this proliferated.
Right, and I should say, I wasn't the one who did the evaluation. That was all Angela Hawkins' work. And oddly enough, all the people who completely believed her preliminary results from Proposition 36 in California, which was a treatment diversion program. The early studies suggested that was actually working rather well. All the people who believed her when she said that, none of them believe her when she says Hope works better.
By the way, just comparing it to treatment, I'm more pro-treatment than you are. I think there's a couple of things to note, which I don't think you disagree with, but which I would just bring up as differences in emphasis. One is, from a sort of cost-benefit analysis point of view, substance abuse treatment looks great because if you reduce, if you make people more functional and have them commit fewer crimes, these treatment interventions are very inexpensive compared to almost anything you do in medical care. So if you have any positive impact, they pay for themselves, very quickly. And so I did some work with Anirban Basu and David Paltiel, where we just looked at armed robberies, and we found that it was less than 10% of the people in treatment in the data that we had were armed robbers, and it was actually a pretty criminally active group of people that we looked at.
Right.
But just the effect of reducing robberies among the robbers, way more than paid for the intervention for everybody. And many of those robbers were actually never arrested for robbery. They just said, "Yeah, I commit armed robberies." And so if you can bring down the rates of antisocial behavior and reduce the rates of drug use, you're not going to lead to people being permanently abstinent. That's sort of a long process. But you can do a lot with people that makes that more than justifies the intervention. Certainly from a cost benefit point of view. I would also say that there's different populations of people. The hope intervention. I draw a big distinction among people with drug problems between those who are hurting other people and those who are not. And there's an incredible need for doing more for people with drug problems who who are not criminals and who are not doing antisocial behavior, but who do need help of one sort or another. And doing that through the primary care system is really important. There's a bunch of things we can do. When someone is actually becoming antisocial because of their drug or alcohol use, then the situation becomes one where a much more intensive form of monitoring and sort of graduated sanctions is really often what's required, because the alternative is you really have to lock that person up.
Right, and to be fair, you said that a lot of the enforcement stuff hasn't been subjected to randomized controlled trial. Neither has much of the treatment stuff. If you look at the treatment literature, most of the randomized trials are about methadone, which works, and most of the stuff that purports to show that other forms of treatment work is very weak designs, comparing people who complete the treatment with people who drop out, which the answer that's going to give you, but it's not the right answer.
Yeah, we published that in the Journal of Selection Bias, I think.
Exactly. Well, but the Journal of Selection Bias publishes virtually all of the drug treatment research.
There's a lot of bad research done, and that's certainly true.
And the belief that drug court is somehow magical, which we're now pushing on third world countries, which certainly can't afford it. Drug courts select their clients to be the opposite of what you said. People who mostly aren't doing anybody else any harm. And they have very modest success results. The case for drug court is, if the judge would have been stupid enough to put this guy in prison if there hadn't been a drug court, then the drug court's a lot cheaper.
Yeah. Well, what we found was drug court was pretty valuable for individuals, but that it was just not going to have it's really not going to have an effect on the population of, certainly the American prison population, right. And partly because a lot of the people who, if you just look at the rules for who's allowed into a drug court, right. A lot of the people, if you have a history of violent offenses or you're caught with a gun, a variety of things like that, you're just not eligible for drug court. So there's a sort of other than that Mrs. Lincoln aspect to what we can accomplish with these, because those are the people that are really going to fill the prisons. So so drug court itself, it's a good thing for a particular population, but it's very easy to oversell what the current conception of drug courts is. What we can realistically accomplish with them.
Right. Where the good thing is mostly that they're not going to prison and they're being put in drug court instead. It's not that they're getting spectacular treatment results. And yet drug court is extraordinarily well funded, politically popular, and hope is something we're still studying.
What's interesting, I take solace in the popularity of drug courts, independent of whether they're oversold, because I do think that the culture war over drugs to some extent has quietly ended, and that there's a tremendous consensus among people with lots of different ideological views that we're putting too many people in prison in things related to drugs, that we have to find a better way, and that people who are not violent in their use or even in their production and distribution of drugs, people who are not violent in that activity, we have to find less punitive ways to deal with those people. And I think that is actually a very positive turn in the conversation that I think reflects progress on these issues.
Yeah, I can give you some evidence for that. A year and a half ago, I got invited to a meeting by Newt Gingrich.
Isn't he? Wasn't he speaker at some couple?
Yes. The epithet, I think, is discredited Speaker of the House.
Mm-hmm. That's the last I heard of him.
Last anybody heard of him. And it was a very interesting meeting. It was a dozen people like Gingrich, conservative politicians and activists, and a dozen sort of liberal criminologists. I was sort of the median voter in the room. And it was all about reducing incarceration. And his pitch was that the mass incarceration that we now have in this country, with 1% of the adults behind bars, is contrary to all the conservative principles he knows. It was an interesting conversation. I talked about hope, which seemed to interest people. And then Mr. Gingrich promised that there'd be some follow-up to it. And leaving the meeting with Mark Maurer of the Sentencing Project, I said, well, one thing you know for sure, if there is any public follow-up on this, the rumors that Gingrich is running for president must be false. Nobody's going to run for president on the Republican side on a platform of fewer people in prison. So last January there appeared a website of an organization called Right on Crime, Gingrich, Grover Norquist, Ed Meese, and Bill Bennett, saying we have too many people in prison and here's what we have to do to have fewer people in prison.
Yeah, I think that's a really genuine thing, by the way. I don't think that's
they're completely real about it.
And I think there's a bunch of libertarians who come at that from a libertarian perspective, and there's also a lot of social conservatives who come at it from a variety of perspectives that might be labeled compassionate conservatism, which, I think they very much believe that our social policies are failing when we are. Especially because it's so obvious that the people who are locked up selling drugs are so disproportionately drawn from the black and brown population compared to the population of people who are buying the drugs and using the drugs. Not that people who use drugs are a cross section of America, but it is clear that there's an element of disparity there that we need to be troubled by.
But here's what seems to me like the interesting observation that completely supports your point. So somebody with a similar name to Newt Gingrich is now running for president and arguably the leading contender on the Republican side. And Mitt Romney has attacked him on immigration, attacked him on getting money from government-sponsored enterprises, attacked him on his marital record, attacked him on global warming, attacked him on a bunch of things where Romney's point is that Gingrich is not sufficiently conservative. And neither Romney nor anybody else on the Republican side has pointed to this website saying we have too many people in prison. That doesn't seem to them like a vulnerability for a Republican presidential candidate. And that, Sherlock, is the dog that did not bark in the nighttime.
Yeah, that's...
the politics of crime has radically changed when that's...
Now, one thing is, crime is down right now. I mean, the disparities are quite high. Here in Chicago, we have a tremendous youth homicide problem. But for, middle-class people who spend their time in the Loop and the near North Side and in beautiful Hyde Park, our physical safety is really... quite good, and we don't quite live in a Western European city when it comes to homicide, but boy, we come pretty close, and I think that also makes it a little easier to have this conversation. I think if we had another crack epidemic and people were walking around genuinely scared, that you would see the backlash politics of crime in a way that right now you don't really see in the same way.
We've had a 50% decrease in crime in the last 15 years. Now, what's fascinating about that is that I've got 6 theories about why it happened, and so do other people, but nobody predicted it any more than anybody predicted the crime explosion at the start of 1962.
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
So it's a pretty mysterious.
By the way, of course, we've also kept in place a lot of the policies that might have made sense when crime was really high, but that seem much less sensible now. I mean, you look at the prison population. It is. We have a set of policies that would be much easier to justify if we were walking around in the middle of the crack epidemic than walking around in 2011. It seems to me.
Right. The last time we had these crime rates, we had 1/5 as many people in prison.
Wow, that's amazing.
And part of the reason I'm enthusiastic about hope is I don't want to just do it for probationers. We're starting to do it with parolees and getting some good results. I'd like to extend it to the bail population. But I'd also like to take a very large fraction of the people currently in prison and let them out on drug testing and position monitoring with GPS. And they're promised if they don't do exactly as they're told, they'll be back inside. And my belief is that a very large fraction of them would behave themselves.
By the way, what do you think? Let me ask you a question.
To their gain and ours.
I mean, since you're noting a bunch of things, what do you think of the Obama administration, how it's doing on drug policy?
Well, so when Ivanov said, no, we hate methadone, and we like spraying, you report that Gil Kurlikowski said Afghanistan's a sovereign nation.
Yeah, and he said methadone's and needle exchange have worked well in the United States.
Right. Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear him say that. I'd like to hear him say, why don't you do that there? Right? You're contributing to the problem in Afghanistan through the consumption of your customers, and we know how you can stop doing that. I'm delighted that he said the drug war is over, but he hasn't said we have 500,000 people in prison for drug dealing, and that's too many, or proposed any policy that would reduce that number. I'm very grateful that Kurlikowski personally has been an advocate for hope, but there's not a lot of action on that front. There's the Justice Department has 4 counties now they're supporting to do hope replications with new randomized controlled trials. So if all that works very well, 3 years from now we'll know what we know now, which is this stuff works if you do it and doesn't work if you don't.
It's interesting that I mean, he's definitely changed the tone of the way he talks about drug policy. You know, if you think about some of his predecessors like Jim Walters and Bill Bennett,
John Walters.
I mean, he's a gentleman.
Or Barry
yeah,
McCaffrey.
the way that I would put it is he's a gentleman, and many of his predecessors have not been. And they've sort of used the drug war as a front in the culture war in a way that he's not. It's interesting that on the left, the Obama administration has been pretty criticized for its approach to marijuana, and you know more about marijuana than I do. I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Well, on the left and among libertarians, I mean, it's not as if the marijuana legalization movement is specifically politically left as opposed to culturally. I mean, I certainly agree that Gil Kurlikowski is a gentleman. He may be excessively gentle for the job he holds. He hasn't displayed any real willingness to crack heads. And not clear how much support he'd have from the White House if he were to do that. But some of us would like to see him more aggressive. On the marijuana front, it's not been a spectacular performance. So Attorney General Holder said early in the administration, we're not going to go after patients and caregivers in states like California where under state law medical marijuana is legal, even though it's illegal under federal law. Now, even at the time, he said we're going to go after for-profit enterprises, and said that the tolerance was only going to be for people who were abiding by their state law. Well, the medical marijuana business racket in California, a business that serves mostly people without medical need. If you look at the profile of the people getting marijuana from the dispensaries, they look a lot like pot smokers and not a lot like patients. They're young, apparently healthy men. I'm not saying that none of them have medical problems. I mean, not all medical problems are obvious, but the customer profile of the dispensaries is not a patient profile. It's a $1 billion a year business. It's not in accordance with California state law, which specifies cooperatives, and almost all of the dispensaries are operating as for-profit businesses. So I think at the instance of the Drug Enforcement Administration and the U.S. attorneys in California, the administration has now said, well, we're going to crack down on some of these medical marijuana operations in California. That's seen as backsliding, even though, as far as I can tell, it's consistent with the words, if not the music, of the original Holder statement. But I don't think anybody can claim that this has been a triumph of communication strategy. I think it's left a lot of people confused. I think the early statement was taken as a green flag.
Well, I think, by the way,
your
that
engines.
in the long, I think we are on a path toward certainly substantial depenalization of marijuana across the country, and it seems to me that there's, if you say what's the direction of momentum in this, it seems hard for me to see that marijuana enforcement is going to be is this kind of a sustainable enterprise.
It's tricky. I mean, imagine that it doesn't look like the California marijuana advocates are going to be able to put their bongs down long enough to agree on ballot language for next year, which strikes me as a strange decision, given that I think something could pass. Prop 19 got within 7 points. It was very badly drafted, very little funded. I think a better drafted proposition, it would be harder to come up with a worse drafted proposition in a presidential year rather than an off year, would very likely pass. That's not going to happen, but Colorado's got something on the ballot, and it looks like Washington State's going to have something on the ballot. Now, according to Bo Kilmer and John Calkins and Rosalie Pakula and Peter Reuter at RAND, who've been working on this stuff, if a state were to legalize, have no enforcement against cannabis production at the state level, you could produce high-quality marijuana for about $40 an ounce, compared to about $300 an ounce currently. And that would mean that a drug dealer in New York would be better off sending a truck to Colorado and buying it retail and hauling it back than getting it from his Mexican distributor.
So let's talk about Mexico. So, I mean, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So, I mean, you might say that would be a really good thing because it would, in addition to our trade deficit, it would, we would put these Mexican cartels at least out of the marijuana business.
Right, but putting them out of the marijuana business takes away about 20% of their revenues. There was a zombie statistic running around about 60% of the revenues from marijuana, but that was completely made up. And
say what the zombie statistic was. I don't think that.
The 60. It's a zombie statistic because it remains walking even though it's been killed repeatedly.
Oh yeah, and the statistic was that 60% of the profits of the Mexican drug cartels was coming from marijuana.
Marijuana exports to the U.S.
That's the false statistic that was out there.
Yeah, and it's since been retracted. So yeah, you do them some damage. But it seems to me if Colorado did that, the pressure on the federal government to send a lot of agents to Colorado to work on marijuana cultivation and dealing cases would be very strong. Because otherwise, Colorado, by legalizing, would have massively increased cannabis availability for the entire country. And
it would force a national policy decision.
Right.
Either you would do that, or you're effectively saying, okay, the floodgates are open.
Right. Exactly.
And it's by the way, so I don't know how many listeners who are still listening now, but the 40,000 deaths in Mexico in the past several years in the war that's been going on among the drug cartels and between the cartels and the government. What should we be doing about that?
That's an interesting question. If there are no further questions, I've got a proposal about what to do about that, which I've been...
By the way, I should tell people, that's like the number of American combat deaths in Vietnam.
Right.
I mean, to give you a sense of perspective there.
Right, or to put it a different way, Mexico now has about 3 times our homicide rate per capita. Yeah. And it's heavily concentrated in a relatively small number of places. So places like Juarez are just astoundingly dangerous. I'm told that the level of violence seems to have peaked, which would be good news if true. My view is that the U.S. and Mexican governments have created incentives for violence by ramping up the level of law enforcement in Mexico. The natural tendency of drug enforcement is to make drug dealing more violent by raising the stakes. And so if I were in charge, I would try to create disincentives for violence. And the way I'd try to do that, I think, is to announce that we're going to pick the most violent organization and put it out of business. And I claim that we can put it out of business not by arresting all of its leaders, the high-value targets that we keep going after, but rather by taking away its customers. If we threaten U.S. drug distributors that are being supplied by whichever organization we picked out as the most violent, that we will go after them unless they find a new source. They'll find a new source. So I think we can make any one of those organizations uncompetitive by focusing our U.S. domestic enforcement efforts on its U.S. customers.
There's two things about that are really striking. One is a lot of drug enforcement is based on focusing on the people who are moving the most product. And it's just a fundamental shift to say, let's focus on the people who are the most violent.
Right.
And it's a difficult shift to make for a lot of reasons.
Moving the most product, or simply whoever we've got a case against. A lot of it's pure accident, who the informant pointed to. Some of it's strategic, and I think we need to make it more strategic, and again, around violence, not around volume.
It's really striking to me that if we could turn the Mexican drug cartels, two things. One is if you compare Afghanistan to Mexico, you realize how different those two situations are. Poppy is a huge chunk of the Afghan economy,
right.
Certainly of the agricultural economy. And when you go and you do aerial eradication, you are basically destroying a chunk of the Afghan GDP and dealing with creating a lot of economic damage to that country given where it's at.
Right.
And it's hard, and obviously there are efforts to find substitutes and to do things to encourage farmers to substitute away, but you have this fundamental dilemma that it's a big part of their economy. I did some calculations about the Mexican drug cartels. These are, if they were a legit industry, they would really be like the Wrigley's Gum Company in terms of a lot of the dollar values involved.
Right.
They are, and Mexico is $1 trillion economy. Right. So it is, these are a fundamental, in a lot of ways, these are a fundamental drag on the Mexican economy in a large sense, even though, of course, they generate large amounts of money in particular places for particular people.
Right.
So there's just this, but the other thing is if we could turn them into the mafia and say, okay, they're doing some things, it would be a big step forward. The American mafia doesn't go and try to find out the home addresses of FBI agents and go and assassinate them. They don't. They don't turn American judges. They really are. They stay out of confrontations with the state.
Right, and that was always true because we had a stronger state than Mexico had. And it's also true that we mostly managed to put the mafia out of business, except in New York. So my notion would be take the most violent organization, put it out of business, and then announce you're running the contest again. Now we're looking for the second most violent organization, and hope that nobody wants to be the second most violent organization, and that they will compete in reducing their violence level to stay out of your gun sight. Like the bear in the Far Side cartoon. You're looking at a gun sight at a bear, and there's a bear standing next to him, and the bear's going. So
I can't see, but I take it he's pointing to the other bear.
He's pointing to the other bear, and I don't know that would work, and I can list 6 reasons why it might not. I don't know of any proposal currently on the table that's likely to reduce the level of violence in Mexico substantially, and most of them are either perverse or simply not going to happen. Other than hope, we don't have a prospect for greatly reducing U.S. drug consumption in the short term. Mexico has no prospect of suddenly having an effective police force and judiciary.
Let me mention, by the way, a couple other things. One is, if we say how is the Obama administration doing on drugs, I think one thing that I always would emphasize, it's partly one of those "and Carthage must be destroyed" type points that you just always have to make, is the single most important thing that the Obama administration is doing in drug policy is health reform.
Right.
By a wide margin. You mentioned screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment. There are a number of particulars in health reform to try to bring substance abuse treatment within regular medical care and to do it properly, but also this idea that we actually will insure everybody. And if you just imagine a guy who's bumming quarters up on 57th Street here in Hyde Park, who's a drug user, he's not a vet, he's not a mom, he's just a poor guy with a drug problem.
Right.
If you say he needs treatment of some sort, maybe he needs psychiatric treatment, maybe he needs methadone, maybe he needs whatever.
He needs to go out and commit a burglary. He needs to go out and commit a burglary, and then get a drug diversion program.
Yeah, and that's the irony, is that the criminal justice system becomes a major portal. right now, that guy's not eligible for Medicaid because he doesn't fit with any of the categorical silos that we have. But after 2014, you just say, well, he's poor. His income is below 133% of the poverty level.
Right.
He's eligible. And then not only can you treat his drug problem, but you can also treat his hypertension and everything else that he's got going that chronic drug users tend to have. And I think that as a public health policy wonk, I look at health reform as the central pillar in almost all of the policies we're really struggling with to deal with these severely disadvantaged populations. And
right.
It's sort of it's a source of sadness to me that a lot of my political and ideological compadre are focused on other things like the public option, which are certainly valuable, but are not focused on the day-to-day realities of the public health system that has to deal with all of these people with severe problems that are, A, uninsured, and B, even if they were insured, the way that the healthcare system is working right now is not designed to meet the needs of these critical populations, and there's just hundreds of pages in the Affordable Care Act that tries to change that. And so...
and that's the great tragedy of contemporary American politics, that even the most extreme people on the right know there's a hell of a big difference between the two parties. And even relatively moderate folks on the left have come to be unable to distinguish.
I think there's just I think we distinguish it, but there's a level of ambivalence and passivity that and a sense that a lack of appreciation of a tremendous accomplishment, in my view, that needs to be to be noted.
Or a lack of appreciation for the level of the threat. I mean, Mitt Romney, who was a reasonably moderate, modestly competent governor of Massachusetts, is running for president on the raving loony party ticket. And that's what he thinks he has to do to get a Republican nomination. And the people who fantasize that he's going to go back to being a moderate, as if that were what he really was, instead of what I take to be the truth, which is what he really is an office seeker. And he's saying now what he needs to say to be a Republican president, and that will be true if he's ever a president, God forbid.
Yeah, I have a piece coming out, which I will not anticipate, but where I try to go through some of the health reform politics, and it seems to me it's very clear that what you're saying is very clear. But that will be no doubt our next blogging head.
Absolutely.
Did we cover everything on our agenda? I think the only thing I'm looking at that go ahead.
We may not have exhausted our agenda, but we probably exhausted our viewers' patience.
I think we have.
We should probably sign off.
We have.
Harold, it's always a great pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise, Professor Kleiman.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.